Hello and welcome back once again to Southbank Live. We're now on episode 37. I think I may have misspoke last week and said last week was 37, but this week we are actually on episode 37. Wishing you all a very good evening to all who have tuned in today. If you are in the UK, of course, you may be on a different time zone. It is great to do these live as ever, and we shall be taking live questions and comments from the chat. But joining me today is John Butler. John, how are you getting on this evening?
Very well, Boaz. How about you?
Very well indeed. I'm currently situated in Cardiff. Haven't been to Cardiff before, so I'm exploring the city as best I can during the day. Very interesting place to be. But John, we do have much to discuss this evening. It's been yet another action-packed week in the
Yeah.
markets. To start us off with, to everybody who is watching, I thought we'd start with our long-short section once again, as that did prove to be a success last week. This is the section where we do not give financial advice, but simply take a look at events and markets over the last week and give a long and a short, or say what we're bullish on and something that we are bearish on. Again, this is just for entertainment purposes, so please don't take it seriously and start betting on this stuff in actuality. But John, could you start us off with your long for this week?
Yes, I think that it seems to me, based on recent rhetoric from multiple central banks, they're beginning to realize that they've burned through way too much credibility, letting inflation get as far as it's gone, rising as far as it has, and yet having done precious little about it. And it seems to me, again, reading between the lines a little bit, that they feel, at least in the short term, and I stress this is a short term idea, they are perhaps now going to try to demonstrate that they may have been asleep at the wheel, but they're wide awake now and do something to surprise the market, or at least meet hawkish expectations, if not exceed them. And that is a real sea change over the way things have been operating, the modus operandi, as it were, of central banks over the past decade. So I think that's an interesting one for markets to digest. And what that means is that I think they're going to try to, they're going to be willing to tolerate what has been a surge in bond yields recently and interest rate expectations, and continue to drive that, at least in the short term. And so I would go ahead and continue to position for higher rate rise expectations and higher associated bond yields in the short term, but only in the short term. I don't think they're going to get away with that for very long before they start to cause some rather negative unintended consequences.
Yeah, that's one way of putting it, John. Rather, rather negative unintended consequences indeed. And we can maybe explore some of that later on in this show. If you do have, by the way, a long and a short for this week, do let us know in the chat, as it is very interesting to see what everyone else is bullish and bearish on as the days go by. Because every week, of course, is different. There's so many more headlines that we could discuss. I think for this week, I'm going to take a page out of the crypto book, and I'm going to be long NFTs this week. We have a headline for this. This one comes straight from the Chancellor's office in the British government. Yeah, UK unveils bid to become a global hub for crypto. That's from the Financial Times. So this is Rishi Sunak's attempt to get down with the kids and be very popular by appealing to the crypto side. This is a big political opportunity to make Britain continue to be a financial services hub by getting all the crypto guys in. Now, I thought it was very interesting, John, that Rishi Sunak has asked now the Royal Mint to create a NFT, a non-fungible token, a little piece of Royal Mint artwork by the summertime, because it made me think really that for so many years we've been talking about central bank digital currencies arriving and government created crypto being the next big thing, but it seems like we might actually be looking at CB NFTs, or maybe not CB NFTs, but it seems like government issued NFTs are actually beating us to the punch on this, which is what nobody would have been expecting, because NFTs were dismissed as this digital collectible sideshow. I'm not sure I'm the most bullish on what the Royal Mint creates. I will look forward with great anticipation to whatever it is that they issue and what blockchain they issue it on. But I think I'm long NFTs. Also this week, I think it was actually just yesterday evening, or actually just yesterday, OpenSea, which is the largest marketplace for NFTs, started accepting Solana NFTs, so another big blockchain, another big ecosystem, sort of being mounted onto the OpenSea website, which is obviously going to be very, very good for all of the people who bought all these Solana NFTs beforehand. So I think my long for this week is the NFT market. But John, moving on to your short, what would your short be for this week?
My short is actually very closely associated with my long. That is, interest rates are going up. Central bankers are going to give it a go in the short term. However, I don't believe they're going to have the impact on their domestic currency strength that they expect. Normally, other factors equal, when central bankers begin raising interest rates and at least meeting or perhaps exceeding market expectations, they expect their currencies to rise, at least in relative trade weighted terms. I actually think that's not going to work this time around. They're going to think they're doing oh such a great job, but they're not going to achieve the desired results. Why? Well, guess what? They have models. They rely on models. Those models are backward looking, not forward looking. They don't incorporate potential recent qualitative shifts in the way the global investor base perceives the risk reward around their expected policy actions. And normally you'd think, okay, guys, so let's surprise the market. Let's raise interest rates a lot. It'll really strengthen our currency. Might not happen this time around. And the reason why is because of what we've discussed in recent episodes. That is that as a result of de facto, I stress de facto, as a result of de facto capital controls, which are necessary to fully implement a huge sanctions regime that is continuing to be built out
Yeah.
around the conflict in Ukraine on both sides, right? Everyone's doing it. That is not the sort of open, transparent, liquid level playing field for capital flows that would normally follow from a typical backward looking model comparing interest rate movements and exchange rate movements. And so all the models are not going to work. They're not going to work. They're not going to be worth anything in this sort of environment. And yet, let's be kind about this, but academic types who have studied time series analysis their entire life, who run central banks nowadays, they hate stuff like this. They absolutely hate it. They want to be able to ground a model in a time series. And so that's what they'll do. And when they present it to the board of the Fed, the Bank of England, the ECB, Bank of Japan, whoever it is, and say, hey guys, if you just raise interest rates by 0.75%, maybe 1%, this will be the impact on the currency. This will be the impact on inflation as a result of that stronger currency. They're all going to get it wrong. They're going to get it so wrong, it'll be embarrassingly wrong in retrospect. Now, that said, it's going to take a while to get there. And in the meantime, the trade should work well. You want to bet on them really going for it in the near term, raising interest rates and thinking they're going to look like heroes by doing so. But then don't actually also expect the currencies to rise by much. The currency that will be rising in this environment is the one I've talked about before. It's not a currency at all. It's real money. It's gold. It will be the net beneficiary of all of this. But that becomes a longer term trade, right? That's the position you continue building throughout this process.
Very interesting, well thought out as ever, John. A very good long short. Mine are always the the less well thought out, lighter hearted kind of.
But they're entertaining.
Yeah, yeah. So we're fully hedged here. We've got
Well,
both sides. I think for my short this week is I'm short British public figures who are not domiciled in the UK.
oof.
If the recent news is any judge, I don't think those guys or those girls, for that matter, are in for a very good time at the minute. Some very interesting comments in the chart as ever, in the chat, sorry, as ever. Jason says Rishi wants to be PM. Says Jason, I would imagine Rishi does want to be PM. I think he was only an MP for 2 years before becoming Chancellor, which is quite remarkable, sort of the aggressive rise to power. But I do suspect that maybe all of this stuff about his wife, who is obviously incredibly wealthy, not being domiciled in the UK is maybe coming from the Boris Johnson camp, who want to cause a bit of a distraction over getting fined for Partygate. But that's just a theory on my side. I would be very interested to see what our viewers think of the current debacle at the minute. Andrew is long anything physical and short Boris getting a fine, which is a good pairing there. I like to think with my long for the NFTs and with the Royal Mint NFT idea proposed by Rishi, and then being short British public figures who are not domiciled in the UK. I think I'm quite hedged because there's Rishi Sunak in both of those. It feels there's a theme there. Now, John, on the topic of inflation, John T says there must be loads of inflation to come. Goldman Sachs has stated on Monday that gold, $2,500, is achievable this year. Now, this is very interesting because when Goldman Sachs gives a price target for something, a lot of people see that as a bit of a contrarian indicator. That means the price is going to go down. And I've actually made in a previous episode of this, I've said gold $2,500. That was the same number. So maybe I don't feel quite so sure of it. What would you say, John? What, am I? Is Boaz and Goldman Sachs correct, or are we both wrong?
It's interesting you say that because Goldman historically has been a bullish house when it comes to risk assets generally. And look, it's understandable. They originate a lot of the stuff, and they earn huge fees by originating and distributing a lot of this stuff. And so you can see the bias in the business model. That said, to be fair, I mean, sophisticated investors know that, and they know to discount Goldman's perennial bullishness on risk assets. But I'll say this, that has been concentrated largely in the equity market. There's been the occasional call that Goldman has made when it comes to proper macro, interest rates, currencies, commodities. A lot of those calls are right. I think they're more 50-50 in that area. So leave the equity market aside. If you're looking at anything else, actually, there might be something to it, and I would give it a fair hearing. And I actually have quite high regard, and indeed am a former colleague and acquaintance, or current acquaintance, I should say, of multiple current Goldman strategists / economists. And so, don't get me wrong, I have no privileged information here. That's not what what those relationships are about. But it's more of an insight into character. And these are hardworking, smart, and honest people who, don't get me wrong, you got to push the envelope when you work in that sort of role, right? Occasionally be a bit provocative and whatnot. I've been in that sort of role in much of my life, but don't just discount that. Whereas Goldman's equity department does have this reputation for being just perennially bullish no matter what, and so I wouldn't take that at face value necessarily.
Right. You got to listen to which side of Goldman Sachs is giving and of course what asset they are giving these predictions on. Now, moving on to our next sort of topic, our next slot for this evening, we do have a headline on. This is on the Russia-Ukraine situation. So, of course, we should always have some kind of update, I think, on the Russia-Ukraine situation. Here, we've got Russia moving closer to default as Washington blocks debt payments through U.S. banks. So this is from the Financial Times. Very interesting situation here. So we've got Russia's foreign exchange reserves have been frozen when they're outside of Russia, obviously when they're in US banks. So especially the dollars and the euros have been frozen by all these countries, but mostly the US. And the US has taken this position of effectively attempting to make Russia default on its debt, even when Russia does have the money. So there's these bonds coming up which are denominated in dollars. Russia needs to pay its creditors some dollars in order to pay the interest on these loans. And JP Morgan, which would be processing these payments to the bondholders, asked the U.S. Treasury, should we be helping out with this? And the U.S. Treasury said no. Which is very interesting because when you think of somebody defaulting, you think of somebody not being able to pay on a loan. You think it's because they've not got the money. And there's obviously Russia's under a huge amount of stress at the minute. But when it comes to their actual foreign exchange reserves, it does have the money to pay it. It's just that they are being forced. They can't access the money. So they've got this piggy bank in order to pay this loan, and they can't do it because the piggy bank has been effectively removed and put in a jail somewhere by the U.S. Treasury Department and by all of the European nations as well. So it's a very interesting situation, John. I wanted to get your thoughts on it because it's not something I've heard of before, where a country defaults not because it lacks the money, but because it has been restricted from paying by by another country, in this case, the United States. Because when you think of credit ratings for countries and the credit worthiness of countries, you're thinking about the economy and the ability of the government to pay it, rather than whether or not they will be able to pay it, even if they've got the money. Has this happened before? Is there a comparison elsewhere that we can draw?
There might be, but probably not on this scale, affecting such a large amount of debt. But what you're talking about here is, yes, if Russia misses a payment, technically that's a default, but only technically. You could argue you then enter a very gray legal area because, of course, Russia can say, well, hold on. These contracts are written under U.S. law because they're U.S. Dollar denominated debt, for example, in the case of the ones being administered by J.P. Morgan. And the U.S. is now acting within that U.S. legal context to say, oh, these contracts written under U.S. law are now invalid, and we're going to overrule them as the government. Well, it just so happens that the way the Constitution and other founding legislation of the U.S. is written, the U.S. cannot override private contracts under U.S. law without going through the court system, right? They actually have to they have to bring a case, and that case will have to be heard by presumably a federal circuit court. And eventually, if it's continued to be appealed and disputed by, in this case, the investors who want to be paid, probably, it ends up at the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has to rule. And of course, at that point, if the executive branch is is the one trying to prevent that happening, and yet the Supreme Court says, well, look, this is bubbled up to us through the federal appeals court system, we kind of have to hear the case. Well, then you have a constitutional crisis, which who knows how it would be resolved, but it would need to be resolved at that point. Now, I'm not saying it'll come to that because that takes a long time. The court system is usually very, very slow. There's the occasional something or other that gets expedited, but given the current mood in the United States vis-a-vis the conflict in Ukraine, I suggest it would just sort of be shelved and slow walked such that the technical default would take place. The coupon payments would not be made. Any investors in those dollar-denominated Russia bonds would not receive their coupons, but would they be able to go after Russia for recompense? Of course not. And then again, there are other angles here. There might be some insurance policies linked to these contracts. There might be some CDS linked to these contracts.
Yeah.
And it starts to become a real legal headache for the U.S. government if all the people in theory on the receiving end aren't receiving something. Anyway, it's not as neat, clean, and tidy, these sorts of sanctions, as the U.S. would like them to be, or other countries involved in this would like them to be. And indeed, history suggests that maybe that's a reason why when you impose sanctions on countries, they're overwhelmingly on physically traded goods, because those can easily be interceded under a huge body of international law, whereas these sorts of remittances and the legal claims to these remittances and what constitutes a default is far from clear cut. So in a way, the U.S. and other countries participating in the sanctions here, they've opened a can of legal worms that are not easily dealt with.
Who do you think would... I mean, do you think there's the political will at the ground level when you're thinking of the legal system in the US to sort of start raising this and to start causing a lot of fuss over it?
Look, it's hard in the current political environment, okay, to raise an issue. But you can't tell me that there are certain investors out there who will believe that they are being unfairly treated by their government, who will come into contact or reach out to some hotshot young lawyer who sees an opportunity to make his or her name, bringing a case that legally actually has a lot behind it, even if politically it's unpopular. The U.S. is a very litigious society. There are many, many prominent lawyers in the U.S. today who sailed against the political tide for years in their careers, and eventually had a big win in some, class action or liability or tort case or whatever it was. and they become rock stars in the end. There are people, there are talented young lawyers who would see a gravy train, or at least a potential gravy train
Yeah.
here, and would jump all over it and be a real headache to the powers that be, to the extent that those powers that be don't want them to stir the pot.
Very interesting situation. On a similar theme to that, this week we've seen the announcement of yet more economic sanctions, yet more severe economic sanctions on Russia. And it well, it makes me think, well, how much further can you actually go on the sanction side? I thought they'd already thrown the sink at Russia. Like, what more is there left in the bag for them to chuck that way when the Germans are still taking the gas?
I think we're way into diminishing returns now. I think the sanctions that made or potentially make a big difference have already been imposed. They may or may not work. Again, it depends on to what extent they can or will be enforced, or that somebody blinks in this game of chicken, as it were. Don't know. But the stuff you're seeing now, it's political window dressing. It's to try and make it look like they're doing more, but really, there's not much in it now. The big barrage has already been fired, and now a few muskets are kind of firing into the smoke, hoping to hit something. I don't think it's terribly meaningful, but it looks good if you're a politician who wants to be seen to be doing
Doing
something.
something.
I think that's pretty much all it is at this point.
Right. Andrew comments, could they pay in rubles? So that is the Russian plan here. That is what the Russian Treasury Department have said. Because the US Treasury is being, quote, unfriendly, I think was the word that they used, we are going to pay this in rubles. So if you open up a ruble account with our central bank, or you have a bank that can do that, then we'll pay you in the equivalent in rubles. This particular contract that is coming up, this particular bond payment, does not state in the legalature, in the legalese, describing what the debt is and how it can be paid. It does not make any room for paying in rubles. So for this particular bond that's coming up, there is not room for that. So it would be technically a default. However, some of the other bonds that Russia has issued do say we can pay in certain scenarios, you can pay in rubles. So Russia's saying, well, we're just going to pay in rubles anyway. But whether or not those people who have lent the money to Russia in the first place are going to be able, under due to the sanctions issued by their own governments on Russia, whether or not they're going to be able to go and claim those rubles, even if they wanted to, is yet another question. And it'll be very hard, I would think, to be an investor who is owed an awful lot of money by Russia and can't get any of it. It's who are you going to get sympathy from in this current environment? I imagine you're going to be in pretty deep water at that point. We do have a lot of questions from the chat. A good evening to Natalia and indeed to Ken, who is in France at the minute. Hope you're having a good time, Ken. No worries that you've missed the start of the show. And indeed to Douglas as well. It's great to have people tuning in live. Apex Cypher, who I believe has an NFT as their profile picture, says crypto is a generic term. Bitcoin is very different to crypto. Do I sense we have a Bitcoin maximalist here with Apex? I do agree. Crypto is a generic term. And of course, Bitcoin, I would say altcoin to altcoin and Bitcoin to altcoin. They're all very, very different. But yeah, Apex, you are correct in that. Do feel free to leave any questions you have in the chat. I'm afraid to Robbie, we can't give tax advice on how to deal with capital gains issuing from things like and paying with things from gold or crypto and things like that. I'm afraid we're not allowed to do that on this show. Moving on to our next topic, or actually before we move on to it, John, because we do have a little bit more time for this segment. Looking at the Russia-Ukraine situation at the minute, are there any news stories or are there any elements that you think we should be discussing in this show?
I think that things have continued to evolve in a way which sadly just makes it more likely that this thing is not going to be over as quickly as I'd hoped. And there are a variety of reasons for that. And they have, again, according to a lot of the media, mainstream media, it's because the Russian army wasn't up to the task. I think there's actually very little evidence that that was the case. I think there's more evidence to suggest that the Russian military operation was more limited in scope than the mainstream media had suggested it would be. they talked about Russia wanting to take over all of Ukraine, something which I said, whatever it was, 6 weeks ago, they just did not have the forces to do, and they knew that, and they wouldn't try to do it. So I think what you're seeing now is you're seeing phase two of the conflict having well begun now, where major military operations are over. The propaganda war on both sides is being ramped up to a higher level. The sanctions war, of course, we already discussed that. They're trying to ramp that up to a higher level, but they escalated that very, very quickly. So there's not necessarily much further to go. Backroom negotiations have finally been taking place. Let's hope they're making some progress, but the sign so far is that progress is limited. But the other thing that's going on, and this is where, good luck getting information on this, is the maneuvering that is taking place still with more, so it appears to be minor military operations in Ukraine, because there is movement taking place. And it could be that this movement is preparation for future major military operations, or at least the threat of future major military operations to try and either A, achieve objectives that have not yet been achieved, or B, be used in negotiations down the road, as in, oh, our army is now here. If you don't agree to, whatever it is, we're going to do this that you didn't, that sort of thing. And so there is a lot of movement taking place. Now, one thing that I think is happening, and this is a guess, I'm just guessing, Russia's number one objective here was to try and force, through military force, let's not discount that, they clearly were ready to use their military force, to try and force through military action a negotiation that would result in what they wanted with minimal further fighting and bloodshed, minimal further cost. They haven't got that. They clearly haven't got that. They wanted that. They wanted a quick win, quick push to the negotiating table, didn't get it. And so, if there's one part of Ukraine where they will absolutely fight it out to the last man, if necessary, inflict civilian casualties if necessary, do all that horrible shit that can happen in war if necessary, it is in eastern Ukraine, right? This is the single most important issue in my mind that's going through Putin and his leadership's mind is, okay, plan A didn't work, but plan B must include pure, absolute, overwhelming military victory over eastern and southern, so southeastern, if you want to generalize, Ukraine. And so it could be that we're going to build up to another major operation, but only in that region. I think that's the only region where it would be concentrated. And then it only expands from there, of course, if NATO gets properly involved, which they could choose to do. I don't think they will. They can't. Again, I don't think they have an effective fighting capability in southeastern Ukraine. So that could be what happens next. I hope it doesn't, because that would be hugely disruptive. And I mean, gosh, who knows how many more civilians will get killed if that happens? But it could be that will happen.
Your theory on what Putin was getting up to in Ukraine in the first place was mainly that he was going for that eastern side of Ukraine in the first place. That was going to be the area that he really claimed, rather than going for all of Ukraine from the get-go, right, John?
Yes, and that the only reason why there was such a large force aiming for Kiev was just to try to get Ukraine to the negotiating table, just to try and say, hey, if you're not willing to talk, we, in theory, have enough artillery pieces in position to flatten Kiev. And I think that when Ukraine was unwilling to negotiate on that basis, I think Russia decided, did a cost-benefit analysis. Are we really prepared to go there? Or is it better just to fight out our more limited objectives directly in eastern Ukraine, where we have an overwhelming advantage? I suspect that's what happened. I think they were hoping that what they had done was sufficient. But keep in mind, from a purely military point of view, pinning down a substantial portion of the Ukrainian military around Kiev allowed the Russian military to make huge advances in the east already. And while they haven't won 100% of that objective, they've won 80%. And so even a minor redeployment of those forces pinning the Ukrainians down around Kiev is the cleanup maneuver, maybe, that's needed now to achieve that particular objective. But sadly, it will have to be achieved by military means, not by having driven Ukraine already to the negotiating table. I think that's what the Russian calculus has been and is evolving as here.
Yeah, it's certainly something we need to be paying an awful lot of attention to, be you an investor or if you're simply interested and fearful of where the world may be heading next. We do have some further questions in the chat. We shall get on to our next topic shortly. Tom comments, Boaz, I love these sessions, but can you please update your picture on the intro screen? You look of an age not legal for Guinness drinking. Well, Tom, if anyone can guess what year that photograph was taken and how old I was, I'll buy you a beer. I will admit it wasn't very recently. Now, in terms of our next topic that I think we should discuss here, and this is narrowing in a little bit more on the UK, we've got a headline here regarding nuclear power that I'd like us to take a little look at. Here we are. This is from The Guardian. Johnson to bet big on nuclear energy despite Rishi Sunak's reservations. Delayed strategy expected to focus less on onshore wind turbines in England amid conservative backlash. So here we come to the nuclear question once again, and the rollout of nuclear energy, whether or not this is something that we're finally going to see another nuclear age, another atomic age, as everyone realizes that nuclear energy is really, really good. But at the same time, as it's Boris Johnson's idea, he's really, really, he's not exactly well known for delivering on very grand promises of civil engineering. You wonder if this is just another Boris boondoggle and whether or not these nuclear reactors will actually be there in the 10 or 20 years where they're planned to. John, what's your take on this? Because obviously this will have huge implications for the future of energy security in this country.
Well, it certainly will, and it's interesting how we got here, right? The UK government regards its energy situation as a trilemma. You want security, you want affordability, and you want sustainability, and that seems a fair framework for understanding what the goal should be. You try to balance out all those objectives. Now, previously, that is over the last couple decades, they thought they could solve that with a heavy emphasis on the sustainability side. That is, that the sustainability side would, if developed at home, would help with security because you wouldn't be any more dependent on foreign imports of energy. And it was also believed that the economics of these technologies were such that energy would remain more or less as affordable as before. Well, that's wrong. That both of them are wrong. That is, sure, you can build it at home, but it really hasn't delivered the amount of reliable base power you need, and it hasn't also made it affordable. So you've failed on two of your three fronts, and even on the front that you supposedly succeeded at by decarbonizing a bit and making things appear a bit more sustainable, actually, the realization that these technologies have been overpromised and underdelivered in such a large scale makes you wonder whether you've almost been hoodwinked, right, and deceived regarding what was promised to you by the companies that were paid billions to develop these and deploy these sources of energy, and so now you see the big pivot. I mean, look, it's been talked about for a while now, but now it's becoming official policy. The fact is, and the UK is not the only country doing this, there is a huge pivot now back to nuclear power. Huge. Because nuclear power is a tried and tested technology. It does allow for reliable base power. It, of course, is produced domestically as long as you build the plant domestically. And it can be done for a cost which is competitive. Now, fine, you might be reliant on foreign uranium imports, but the good news is that uranium is sourced in a wide variety of countries around the world. Yes, okay, Kazakhstan may be the single biggest supplier, but there are many, many others. And so you can diversify your sources of uranium imports. They can be from largely safe jurisdictions. You can stockpile uranium. It's actually not that expensive to store Hence why there are now uranium investment trusts that literally sit on yellow cake
Yep.
because the storage costs are actually at scale. At scale, the storage costs are reasonable. So you can stockpile it. You can have, a full 2-3 years supply for a rainy, rainy few years if necessary. So look, I can see why this is happening. And let's face it, look at the politics of it. We've had a petrol crisis. We have huge spikes now in gas and electricity prices. The recent, breakout of hostilities in Ukraine has yet to fully feed through to less affordability for UK energy. It will, and it will just make the political decision more obvious. They didn't have a choice in this one, right? Circumstances forced their hand. Some of it was self inflicted, some of it was not. But the fact is, the government can no longer deny that the trilemma has become much more of a dilemma. We just need to sort out security and affordability, and we'll get back to considering sustainability and decarbonization. And don't get me wrong, Ukrainian uranium power is low carbon, but it's hard to argue that a source of power that generates arguably the most toxic substance in the known universe is green in a more general sense.
Certainly. Do you think that we will get that? Boris Johnson will actually roll out the huge nuclear development plan that he proposes, where you've got multiple power stations and then you've got small modular reactors, even before the end of this decade in the country?
Now, what you can do, okay, you can at least start building stuff, right? You can at least start moving forward. You can at least show that some progress is being made. Whether any one of these reactors actually comes online that quickly, not sure. Okay, not sure. Yes, it's a proven technology, but it's not a proven technology in terms of being able to build a plant in just a couple of years. That's true. Also, the whole modular concept, these designs have been around for a long time, actually. And some people, including myself, think that modular nuclear may be a very, very good idea because it creates a more distributed grid and it also gets around some of the problems with long range transmission and some of those ugly wires that cover the countryside. Yes, fine, they're necessary for the current generation of power generation in this country, but actually, if you move to modular, you won't be as reliant on long range transmission. Now, smaller reactors are less efficient, and yet they're way more efficient today than they were 20, 30, 40 years ago. Why they weren't even being built back then, because they were inefficient. So who knows? Maybe even that could be achieved now that we've come a bit farther with the technology. But I'm not an expert in that regard.
It's a very interesting topic, the nuclear one, where you have this form of technology which sort of stands apart from fossil fuels and at the same time stands apart from the renewables. It's fair. Everyone has different views on it. When you're talking about how easily uranium can be sourced, John, it does make you wonder how easily it would be to obtain some of this stuff. A while back, one of these defense analysts said that the technology used for making the first nuclear bombs by today's standards is actually incredibly archaic and incredibly easy, which is very worrying to think how easily this could be. That kind of technology could just be could proliferate and be created by
Well,
very
look, that's another angle entirely, right? And
yeah,
this
yeah.
goes back to something I've said before. I mean, any technology can be used for good or ill, and that's certainly true of nuclear technology. And the fact that yes, in theory, you can build a suitcase bomb with small amounts of uranium. Yes, that technology exists, and yes, there are people out there who know how to do it. And yes, some of them might reside in jurisdictions that are not particularly friendly to the United Kingdom. And yes, look, the world's a dangerous place. All right, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. And the idea that I don't see a direct association, though, right, between building a network of modular plants in the UK and somehow enabling someone in some hostile jurisdiction to
Yeah,
build a
yeah.
suitcase bomb. But yes, look, the fact is that this is dangerous stuff. Okay, I mean they call it uranium for a reason, right? I mean the god of the underworld. Okay. Um, and I actually use Prometheus as a metaphor for nuclear technology, because Prometheus was the Greek god that gave fire to mankind, but mankind wasn't responsible enough to use it sensibly and wisely, and ended up burning the planet down. Okay, so we have been warned. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that uranium's the holy grail. I'm just
Oh yeah, yeah.
saying that it fits the current political calculus better than anything else.
Certainly, yeah, and it is very interesting seeing the investment side of it. I believe there's the Guggenheim fund which takes a close look at nuclear energy. It's been very out of favor until quite recently. Uranium in general, watching the uranium futures market over the past several years has been very interesting because you've got in Kazakhstan, which is of course a very large uranium producer.
The
You know,
biggest.
they shut down their mines for a while because they just weren't making any money from it. They weren't going to sell below the cost of producing this stuff, pulling it out of the ground. And so you saw this bottoming in uranium prices. Now we're finally seeing some uptake on the use of nuclear energy. We do see a question here from on the LinkedIn side, or a comment at least on LinkedIn side from Nikki, who says nuclear isn't green and disposal is still a challenge. The UK would be wise to make use of its natural resources, water/hydro, which is quick to come online and feed into the grid. And we're going to be subject to greater flooding in the next 20 years, so we should look to capture this water in reservoirs and use it to our benefit rather than to our detriment. This is a very interesting observation there. I hadn't thought of that with the greater flooding argument and the use of hydropower, how that ties in. What's your take on that, John?
Sadly, because the UK is a relatively low-lying country, obviously Scotland's a bit of an exception, parts of Wales too, but even there, the peaks aren't particularly high. But the watersheds do collect a lot of water. And so, yes, I believe at the margins there are things that could be done there. But you simply cannot compare the UK to Norway or to certain alpine countries that can generate very, very substantial, double-digit percent contributions from hydro to their overall power needs. The UK would really struggle to get there. That said, that only has to do with terrestrial hydro. I have mentioned before, and this is happening up in Scotland, they're experimenting with new seaborne turbines that are turned by the tides. And those who study UK geography know that the tides around the United Kingdom are very, very large, right? You have some really, really powerful, powerful tides around this big island of ours. And if the technology proves practical, you could potentially sink a number of these tidal turbines into a number of bottleneck areas around the coastline of the UK. There are huge challenges ahead with this, by the way. I don't want to suggest it's going to be easy, but in principle, the amount of water flow that you get around the coastlines, if it could be tapped, would, in theory, contribute a tremendous proportion of the UK's projected future energy needs. But we're a long, long way from that being proven practical technology, if ever. We honestly don't know if it's truly going to work in the long term. Salt water is incredibly corrosive over longer periods of time. Electricity transmission under those conditions and the distances involved and whatnot, there are challenges there. But who knows? I wish I wish the people working on it the best of luck.
Certainly, it is interesting to see where this might lead in the future. Though, of course, at the same time, when people think of hydropower and nuclear power, and nuclear power is the dirty one, this is the dangerous one. You know, there have been some absolutely catastrophic hydropower accidents in the past, which people don't really think about so much because people think of it as this green angle. But when you see big dam collapses in China in the mid 70s, there was one that is estimated to have killed 26,000 to 240,000 people as a result of of a dam collapse that was constructed during the Great Leap Forward. And it's maybe an aspect which people don't think of because people think, nuclear dangerous, nuclear equals Chernobyl, but they don't think of big dam collapses that were driven by people wanting to get hydro energy, which is another aspect of it. But that's not what people think of. So maybe it's much politically easier to sell it.
Thing is, though, you are slightly comparing apples and oranges because the problem with nuclear accidents is that the scars on the planet, in theory, last for
Forever.
centuries, or even, yes, exactly. If things go really wrong, even longer than that. not to belittle a dam bust at all, but the current generation that arguably made the decision to build the dam and live in that area benefited from the power from it, and then find there's a disaster. In a way, it's impacting those in the there and now. Tragically, absolutely. But to say that someone not born for another 100 years or 1,000 years should pay the price for mistakes we make today is an extremely presumptuous
Yeah.
attitude. And it's one reason why I do criticize some advocates of nuclear power, because they belittle the long term challenges of dealing with the waste properly and making sure they take care of the planet, while nevertheless trying to take advantage of arguably the most powerful way to generate power in the known universe.
Yeah, very good comment there, Nikki. That brought up an interesting aspect to this whole story. Moving on slightly, this time to I think this is our final article the for this show, where we're looking at capitalism with Chinese characteristics, as it's been called, which was mostly something of a euphemism when we're thinking of the Chinese model as being socialism with Chinese characteristics. That was how it was sold. But then the Chinese model for managing the economy has come to the West slowly, and it seems to be coming sort of ever closer over time. You get more and more stories and more angles to this, and the COVID phenomenon seems to have accelerated this quite a bit. So this was this is from the Financial Times. UK government seeks to make COVID business loan scheme permanent. Bank executives asked for their views on a replacement program aimed at small and medium-sized companies. So, to everybody watching, what we're talking about, the Chinese element of this is that the Chinese Communist Party and their model for economic growth pretty much incentivizes debt creation in the economy, private sector debt creation. And this is something that they've been using very successfully, some would say, for many years, many decades. Well, not many decades, but several decades now. And have used it to grow their economy. So by incentivizing people to take on debt in order to invest in things and continually incentivizing that debt and then only occasionally causing it to shrink, they've been able to grow their economy by an awful lot. During the COVID lockdowns, we saw the government effectively underwrite an awful lot of loans. So banks made loans to private businesses that they would not otherwise, because they thought they wouldn't be able to pay them back, and often in many cases they wouldn't pay them back. But because the government said, don't worry, if the person doesn't or the business doesn't pay it back, we'll cover the cost of the loan. And so as a result, banks take on much more risk than they would otherwise when making loans to private sector enterprises. And this is almost like capitalism with Chinese characteristics coming in through the back door. And here we are, what was an emergency measure being rolled out to the UK proper. So it's when you think of it, most of the money in circulation in the UK generally is not money that's sort of been created by central banks. Most of it is private sector debt created money. So this is money that has been lent into existence by banks to private enterprises and private individuals. And in this way, with the government underwriting loans and wanting to continue to stimulate this, the same way that the Chinese Communist Party have managed to do it in China, this represents to me a big step forward for a great leap forward for capitalism with Chinese characteristics in this country, which is quite worrying in a lot of ways, as you do see the government taking an ever greater interest and a greater hand on the pedal for economic growth here, because of course they can say, well, we're just going to underwrite loans in businesses that we want to succeed and not ones that we don't. So if you're doing something that's green, perhaps whatever's flavor of the month, we'll make sure that we're guaranteeing the loans issued by banks to those businesses. We're not going to do the other ones. And of course it does open the door to all manner of cronyism, and we've seen plenty of that recently as well. But at the same time, it's quite inflationary as well, because of course this is the main method of printing money in this country, is banks issuing loans to private enterprises and individuals. John, what do you make of this? Because it seems like quite an inflationary outcome to me.
Well, it's a huge topic. And look, I mean, there's a long history to this, okay? The idea that credit distribution, not just creation of money in credit, but the specific distribution thereof, the idea that should be to some extent, if not completely, controlled by the government, I mean, gosh, that discussion has been going on forever. And one of the more eloquent presentations of the socialist side of that is that money and credit should be socially created and distributed, was, of course, Karl Marx. And the creation of a centralized system of money and credit was one of the planks of his Communist Manifesto. And so here we have, the UK government saying, well, hold on, not only should um, the banking system create money, but the distribution thereof should be controlled by the government, at least in certain respects. And so, really, we're just traveling another milestone down Friedrich Hayek's road to serfdom here, with respect to the money and credit system. And who didn't see this coming? We've been on this road for a long time. I mean, this is just the next installment, the next increment, the next milestone, as I said. So it doesn't surprise me at all. This is the way money and credit policy has been trending for an awfully long time. The government share of the economy, and yes, of course, that implies the government share of the use of money creation and credit creation and distribution. The government share of the economy is much higher today than it was a generation or two generations ago. And of course, when Friedrich Hayek wrote his Road to Serfdom in the immediate aftermath of World War II, he did it as a warning, saying, hey, you guys may think now that we can demobilize all of this war economy, which is effectively socialized, right? That we can demobilize it now and dismantle it and go back to something that is a more traditional capitalist, free market, private system. But actually, maybe you won't choose to do that. Maybe you'll choose to make a peaceful socialist state out of the warlike one that was necessary to prosecute the war. And obviously, those predictions have been proven correct. And this is just the most recent example thereof.
Yeah, it does feel like we are progressing along the road by leaps and bounds, whereas previously we'd maybe only just
So
been
whether
walking down.
it's inflationary or not, I mean, it probably is, because the fact is that public entities have less skin in the game, right? They're less accountable for their mistakes than private entities. Are private entities going to overinvest? Are they going to malinvest? Are they going to make stupid decisions? Okay, they might now and again, but they'll learn from those. They'll do better next time and they'll move on. Whereas the public sector, when they make a bad decision, they double down. They create even more money. They create even more credit. They throw even more money around to make it look like, oh, gee, we're actually doing more to fix this problem, which of course maybe they created in the first place. That's inflationary. Misallocation of resources is inflationary.
Yeah.
Papering it over with more money and credit is inflationary. Whereas allowing private sector entities that make mistakes to suffer the consequences and potentially go bankrupt is not inflationary. It's clear we've moved from one world to the other.
Yeah. Though when we think of this with the debt creation cycle, so China obviously has been incredibly good at just creating debt in its own economy in order to fund future growth, just pulling more and more consumption from the future. And there have been so many occasions when outside observers have said this is all going to end in tears. This credit expansion has never been seen before in history. This enormous rise in debt, it's all going to end in tears. It's all going to go down. It's going to collapse like a tower of cards, and yet it's not happened. And they've managed to keep doing this by just perpetually incentivizing more and more credit growth. And some people have put this forward as this is the true way of running an economy. You will never. This is what Japan was onto before the central bank started restricting this method. This is the real way everybody should do it, and this is the Chinese miracle. Which, if we applied in our countries, we'd get just as aggressively and rapidly prosperous as the Chinese have become since they started doing it. What's your thoughts on that, John? Because it is quite a convincing argument when you see the number of times when people have said China's going to collapse and it hasn't.
Okay, look, I don't want to downplay what China's achieved. China has taken a poor, largely rural population, and they have modernized and industrialized at scale over a sustained period of time. The average Chinese person, in pure raw economic terms, is better off today than they were a generation ago. And I believe the Chinese public, if you were to just poll them, right, that they would agree with that statement, notwithstanding certain downsides. Okay. That is an achievement. Okay. And it's also happened in many other emerging markets, right? To some extent, it's happened in India, to some extent in Brazil. And of course, there are many smaller countries around the world, some of which have really done well. Okay. So good, good on them. However, and this is a huge however, in all of these cases, they've done so through a fairly traditionalist, mercantilist, export led growth model.
Yep.
Yes, that can work, but it can only work for a finite amount of time. Now, yes, it can be a long amount of time, but you still need that someone to export to. And that
Yep.
country, the default, let's export to it country throughout this period has been the United States. And you've created huge imbalances now as a result. A huge amount of dollar reserve IOUs sloshing around the world that struggle to find a home and end up inflating asset bubbles, which misallocate resources, which suppress productivity growth, and which exacerbate inequality. And the evidence of all of these negative externalities has been growing very rapidly in recent years. Even before, leave aside, Ukraine and sanctions and all that stuff. Even before, these recent hostilities commenced, these were all becoming very, very serious issues for a growing portion of the world's population. That is not sustainable. And so, yes, we've had a long, long run here, which I think is, again, history goes in cycles. You had the Pax Americana following the Second World War. The US became unbelievably wealthy vis-a-vis the rest of the world, both in aggregate and on a per capita basis.
Yep.
That has been steadily eroding for an awfully long time. And the ability for the US to carry the rest of the world today is far, far, far lower than it was a generation or two generations ago. I can't predict when the great rebalancing begins. I suspect if you think in like second derivative terms, rates of change, and this sort of thing, I suspect it already has. And indeed, I write about some of this stuff in my book, The Golden Revolution Revisited. But I do believe that the monetary cycle of history has turned, and the ability for China, or anyone else for that matter, to continue to follow a mercantilist, export led growth policy, we're way into diminishing returns now. And every country is going to have to start to either proactively reorient and begin this rebalancing, or it's going to come upon everyone in an unexpected way as yet another big global financial crisis.
Well, we've got that to look forward to then, John. It is very interesting, very compelling argument there that not everyone can follow this model. There needs to be someone to sell to if you're going to be running
Look,
that model.
once everyone on the planet has exhausted their export led growth opportunities, who's next? Right? Are you going to export to the moon?
Yeah.
No, right? It's a closed system,
Yeah.
right? It can't go on like this forever.
Very interesting indeed. We are getting on a little bit for time. Before we close, I would like to respond to a question from Robbie Head from earlier, which Seamus expanded on a little bit. John, really quick, I think I know what the answer is going to be, but if you were given equal quantities of gold and Bitcoin, and you had a time horizon of, let's say, 8 months, and you had to sell one today, which one would you sell?
Oh gosh, if I had to, I mean, if you're going to force me,
Yeah.
and it's one or the other, I'm long gold and short Bitcoin because gold is proven and Bitcoin's not. So if you're going to force me to choose, I'll choose what's proven, and I will sell what's not. The former, of course, is, you could argue, an old-fashioned conservative approach. The other one is speculative. But at the end of the day, if I'm forced to choose between being old-fashioned and conservative on the one hand or speculative on the other, I will choose the former. And in a way, it's almost not a fair criticism of Bitcoin for me to say that. Who knows where monetary technology is going? Who knows what the future holds? But until I do know, I will favor that which has worked throughout known history over that which has yet to establish itself.
Quite right, quite understandable there. I hope that answers Robbie's question from earlier. I do have a question here regarding the lack of scarf this week from AJ, a regular viewer. Is it quite warm where you are at the minute, John? Not a normal chilly room?
It is warmer. We're in the double digits today here in London, so I've dropped the scarf. That said, it was super windy earlier, and I was traveling down the Thames in one of the Thames clippers, and the sun was out, so I wanted to be on deck. But I have to say, on deck on a rough river with the spray coming at you, I had my scarf on.
Ah, well, I'm sure AJ will be very reassured there. I do like to think Thames Clippers are the best public transport that London has, much better than going on the tube. We do have a few more questions, but we are up for time today, folks. So we shall end it for the minute. Thank you to everybody who has tuned in this evening. It's great as ever to do these live and to respond to what folks put in the chat. It's great to see some returning faces as well. We did cover an awful lot of different topics today, which is always good. Any closing remarks, John, before we head off?
Wow, just that I really do hope, as per our earlier discussion, I really do hope that this thing in Ukraine does not get too prolonged. Look, it's obviously a huge tragedy for everyone in the battle zone. I read earlier today that up to 5 million people now have been displaced as a result of this. That is a colossally large number. And I really feel for these people. So I do hope it's resolved quickly. But I will, from an investor's point of view, right? Um, the stagflationary hangover of all the supply disruptions, food, energy, flow of metals out of obviously the largely the Russian part of the world, but Ukraine has some too,
Yep.
has yet to play out. And as an investor, no matter how sad you feel about all of it, you've really got to keep your wits about you and remain defensive and prepare for even worse stagflationary conditions, 6 months or a year from now.
Certainly does feel like the consequences of all of the sanctions and indeed of the war have certainly yet to be felt properly over
Indeed.
here
Yes.
in the Western nations. So brace for that. And of course, we shall be still hosting these live shows, hopefully by then, so we can catch up with all of the live action as it happens. That is all from us for this week, folks. Thank you so much for tuning in to episode 37. We shall be back next week. And if you're watching a recording of this, do feel free to leave any future questions or future themes you'd like us to cover in the comments below this video. And of course, if you do enjoy these, please give us a like and a subscribe, as that really helps us out. That's all from the minute. John, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure, Boz.
See you later, folks.